In the second half of the 19th century, one of the oldest of all European nations produced its greatest ever cultural achievements. For the people of Norway, the later 1800s represent a golden age of national creativity. In music, the works of Edvard Grieg captured the essence of the Norwegian spirit. In literature, the plays of Henrik Ibsen brought him fame far beyond his northern homeland. And the final years of the 19th century also saw the emergence of a remarkable Norwegian artist, Edvard Munch.
Strindberg said the human spirit had awoken from its solitude and found itself without power because it had lost touch with the transcendental. And I think it's this feeling of isolation and powerlessness that Munch portrays in his work. He does this by showing people in states of emotional tension and stress with great psychological insight. His graphic works were equally powerful and served as an inspiration, in fact, for graphic artists for many years.
Edvard Munch is seen really as an inheritor of Van Gogh's concern with the human condition, human emotion. His work has become symbolic of the human condition as Munch's work, be it The Scream or The Sick Child. And he was able to free artists to be able to actually work along that line. In other words, not to suppress that emotion, both conscious and unconscious. And the background of Scandinavia and the Northern European, of those mythical tales of horror and of drama, is brought into the mainstream of European art.
In 1893, it was Edvard Munch who created one of the defining images of the modern age. At the start of the 21st century, this single painting remains as contemporary and as relevant as it has ever been. This is a perplexing, enigmatic work, an expression of the darker side of the human condition by an artist whose own life was deeply troubled. Munch grew up surrounded by sickness, madness, and death. All his life, he had difficulties with relationships, especially with women. By middle age, he had become an alcoholic, a condition which led to a nervous breakdown. But by this time, Edvard Munch had triumphed over his traumatic life with the genius of his art. Edvard Munch was born on the 12th of December 1863 in the Norwegian town of Løten. He was the second of 5 children born to middle-class parents who moved to the Norwegian capital when he was just 1 year old. What is now the city of Oslo was then known as Christiania, and it was here that Munch's lifetime of troubles began. When Munch was 5, his beloved mother, Laura, died of tuberculosis, followed 9 years later by his favorite sister, Sophie. Later, both his father, Christian, and another sister became mentally disturbed. It's said that Christian Munch took to praying obsessively, often for days on end, and his son, Edvard, later recalled a childhood of misery and darkness.
When he was 22 and painted the picture of his sister dying with his mother in attendance, he was obviously still working through feelings of loss for his mother and for the later death of his sister. I think his early childhood affected his paintings until after his nervous breakdown in 1908. In fact, he refused to have treatment for his depression or his addiction to drink before that time because he felt that he would lose the impetus and intensity which was informing his painting. In other words, he wanted to work out his neuroses himself through paint.
At this time, the influence of childhood experience on adult life was not fully understood. The works of Sigmund Freud were yet to be written. But there can be no doubt that Edvard Munch's miserable childhood had a lasting impact upon him. As an adult, he described how illness, madness and death were the black angels that kept watch over his cradle and stayed with him throughout his life. This is reflected in much of Munch's greatest works.
One can very often simply think of Munch in terms of psychological being and the problems he had as a child. And it is a fact, I think, that when you have been through traumatic experience as a child, that never leaves you. And I think this is certainly the case with Munch. I don't think that the traumas of his early life, I think they're always there, and they fed and were the source material for many of his very powerful paintings.
Munch's childhood could be described as tragic, and its effects never fully left him as an adult. But his early years did have occasional consolation. Following his mother's death, he was looked after by an aunt, Karen Jolstad, a woman with a hobby that was to play a significant part in Munch's life. Jolstad was an amateur painter, and under her guidance, her nephew developed a talent for drawing. By the time Edvard Munch neared adulthood, he had also taken up painting, and his life's passion was beginning to reveal itself. By the age of 17, after a brief spell spent training as an engineer, Munch enrolled at the Norwegian State School of Arts and Crafts. His tutor, Julius Middleton, was a sculptor whose work followed formal and academic conventions. The young Munch soon found himself seeking out more radical influences and became involved with a group of young artists led by the naturalist painter Christian Krogh. Along with another Munch acquaintance, landscape painter Fritz Thaulau, Krogh organized alternative exhibitions of contemporary art. It was at one of these events that Munch showed this early canvas, Morning, a naturalistic, sympathetic image influenced by the work of his one-time master, Krogh. The initial critical reaction to this painting is not known, but it's likely to have been unfavorable. Munch's early works were heavily criticized, especially when he became involved with an even more radical group of creative minds, the so-called Christiania Bohemia. This was an avant-garde movement of intellectuals and artists led by Hans Jager, an anarchist thinker who later sat for this powerfully constructed Munch portrait. This was not the last time that Munch found himself associating with free-thinking intellectuals, but by 1885, the 21-year-old painter was keen to expand his horizons. When his friend, Fritz Thaulau, gave him the chance to travel to the very center of European artistic life, he jumped at the opportunity. In the autumn of 1885, Edvard Munch arrived in Paris. It would not be a long visit. Just 3 weeks after his arrival in the French capital, Munch returned to Norway. But his first exposure to life in Paris gave him a lasting taste for the city. It also gave him a chance to experience the most exciting contemporary development in the world of art, the Impressionists.
Here was colour, here was form, all of them, if you like, shattered, but great excitement, great life. There's a sense of happiness, and that must have been something which he probably felt uncomfortable with. A lack of seriousness, perhaps, is a better way of putting it. But it must have been an impact, I mean, there's no doubt about it. And that what happened then was, of course, that he didn't block it out. He drew from it, and this use of colour particularly is something that he drew from it, and began to use to great effect.
When Munch came to Paris and saw Impressionist paintings, the people he was most interested in were Pissarro and Monet. His palette lightened as a result of this, and his paintings became less gloomy, therefore less heavy. He used the Impressionist brushstroke, but was never completely taken over by their desire to paint what they saw immediately in front of them, often pictures of happiness and gaiety. He just took what he felt was useful for him in the matter of technique, really.
When Edvard Munch left Paris, there's no doubt that he had been inspired by the revolutionary work of the Impressionists. In Norway, his brushwork became freer and his colour more subtle. His friend, Christian Krogh, described him at the time as Norway's one and only Impressionist. However, Munch avoided the shimmering landscapes and bright scenes of bourgeois leisure that inspired such Impressionist artists as Monet and Renoir. Instead, he sought to convey a sense of melancholy, reflective of the sadness caused by his upbringing. The death and illness which dominated Munch's childhood are reflected in the scenes of the deathbed and sick room with which much of his work was concerned. Painted shortly after his return from Paris, his first important canvas, The Sick Child, is an example of such subject matter.
Sick Child is the painting he did when he was around 22 and still working out his feelings concerning the loss of his sister and his mother. He isn't doing this in an entirely naturalistic fashion, but using the colour and the composition expressionistically almost, to give us the intensity of feeling that he felt and wanted to convey to us. He wanted to exorcise it, if you like, in the painting. So it is a very touching work.
Manipulation of colour and the effect, for instance, of the child's pale face, yet vivid red hair, and yet strong and looking upward and out, and the mother, full head of hair, dark hair, but bowed, so that her head really merges into her dress and her body. Then the use of the green around, a green which, once again, words begin not to be of any use. The impression they give, the visual impression they give, simply emphasizes this, the tragedy, and yet the strength and the weakness of this particular setting. It's a deeply human work, that. And he did work over it in a number of variations over the next few years. It's as if it was a constant recurring theme that he wished to come back to.
This melancholy work is now regarded as Edvard Munch's first masterpiece, and it launched him into a period of youthful productivity. By 1889, he was able to put together his own one-man exhibition in Christiania, a bold venture. No less than 110 works were shown at the event. Amongst them, this large canvas simply entitled Spring. Other pictures on display included this image of Munch's sister, Inga on the beach, a picture whose sense of loneliness can be seen as reflective of the existential thinking of the 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. It is this that gives the painting relevance for many modern viewers. But at the time of the artist's first show, it was his more conventional indoor image of spring that made the biggest impression. The canvas was well received and helped to make Munch's name in his home city. The success of the painting also prompted him to apply for an official state scholarship to return to Paris to study under the academic painter Léon Bonnard. His application was accepted, and Edvard Munch was soon back in the French capital. His first visit had lasted only 3 weeks. His second lasted 3 years. In late 1889, Munch arrived at the studio of Léon Bonnard to begin his studies. However, frustrated by the experience of a formal master-pupil relationship, and the conservatism of his tutor, he left after 4 months. Much had happened since Munch's first visit, and the Parisian art scene was now alive with new ideas. Impressionism was giving way to post-impressionism, and the last Impressionist exhibition in 1886 featured the revolutionary neo-impressionism or pointillism of Georges Seurat. Like many other artists, Munch was enthralled by the potential of this dot technique. And Seurat's influence is clearly evident in Spring Day on Karl Johann Street, painted in 1891. However, Seurat's effect on Munch's work was brief. Of more lasting influence was the work of another post-impressionist, Paul Gauguin. In the late 1880s, Gauguin's canvas Vision After the Sermon was completed and was to be regarded as an early example of symbolist art.
Munch enjoyed the decorative effects of Gauguin's painting, and from other symbolist art, say Redon's works, for example, he liked the psychological insight which he saw, which was often quite horrific, in fact. But it was this psychological truth that he was drawn to in the symbolists.
Many admirers of Munch consider Gauguin and the symbolists to have had the most profound influence on the development of his work. In the early 1890s, Munch adopted the symbolist use of colour and a flattened, simplistic rendition of form that can also be seen in Gauguin's finest work. However, like the effect of Seurat on his work, symbolism was not a lasting influence.
One of the great strengths of Scandinavian culture is its concern with myth and therefore conveyance of truth through events which may or may not be factually correct, and the development of that into the sagas, the great myths which resound throughout history and the world. And the symbolists must have therefore, there must have been an echo of that in the symbolist movement.
Munch was also interested in the growing Art Nouveau movement, with its exaggerated emphasis on long, flowing lines. He was also aware of the achievements of the tragic figure of Vincent van Gogh, whose later works used frenzied, curving lines to express his own emotional trauma. The influence of Van Gogh on Munch's work is evident, and both artists would later come to be admired by the expressionists of the early 20th century. Munch is now widely regarded as the first true expressionist painter, but his willingness to absorb so many influences makes it difficult to define his work in terms of a single artistic school.
During the 1890s, Munch was most drawn to the symbolists. He used the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painterly techniques when he needed to, lightened his palette, loose brushstroke, but the subject matter of the symbolists was what really resonated with his own psyche.
He's concerned with the human condition and his relationship to the outside world and its relationship to him, which firmly puts him as an expressionist. But expressionism is a strand which some would argue has gone back over centuries anyway. But certainly it's the result of what was seen in Munch that expressionism itself as a movement developed in the early part of the 20th century. So I'm a little uncertain. I mean, I think if we call Munch an expressionist, I think it's absolutely right to say that. But if we then start to put with him a whole lot of other artists, then I think we're getting on dangerous territory.
Whatever terms are used to describe Munch's work, it's certain that by 1892, at the age of 28, his unique artistic identity had all but formed. Comparison between the 1892 canvas, Evening on Karl Johann Street, and the 1891 neo-impressionist work, Spring Day on Karl Johann Street, shows a significant change of style. The later canvas, is a more modern image, full of the alienation and angst that would characterize so much work of the 20th century. However, in 1892, it was perceived as too modern and provoked outrage amongst the visiting public when it was shown in Berlin at an exhibition organized by the Artists' Association.
In the 1892 Berlin Artists Studio exhibition, Munch exhibited 55 paintings. The exhibition had to close after a week, and his work was called an insult to art, so the critics and the public reacted very adversely to what they saw: the passion, the power, the miserable subject matter, the psychological subject matter. Munch's work was so unacademic that the public found it difficult to accept it.
The 1892 Berlin exhibition was forced to close after just 1 week, but the controversy made Munch a famous figure in Germany. The following year, he began to show his work at a succession of exhibitions in cities such as Dresden, Düsseldorf, Munich, and Cologne. Early in 1893, he decided to settle in Germany, and it was in Berlin that the full genius of Edvard Munch was to be revealed. Once again, Munch found himself moving in avant-garde circles. He met the Swedish playwright August Strindberg, who became the subject of this portrait completed in 1892. Munch's friends also included the Polish novelist Stanislaw Przybylewski, although Munch may have been more interested in his Norwegian wife, Dagny Juel. Munch and his new avant-garde friends became known as the Black Piglet Group after the drinking establishment where they met. It was an appropriate nickname. Alcohol was an integral part of the group's meetings, as can be detected in this Munch portrait of Dagny Juel from 1893. Sadly, alcohol would eventually cause Munch serious health problems. However, in 1893, he was still capable of devoting his full energies to art, and that year created the most famous work of his career, The Scream.
One of the haunting images of the 20th century, and doubtless our own century now, is of Edvard Munch's Scream, because I think it encapsulates the human condition as a whole. The human being, the human race, as being subject in torment, as being subject to forces beyond its control, of being trapped, and of the great cry of anguish to try and to get out. But we can look back to the early 19th century in Germany, to the work of Caspar David Friedrich, where there's haunting images of him, or figures looking out to sea with their back towards you, silhouetted darkly against the sea, which also seems to partake of that same strand of concern with the human condition and anguish.
Despite his apparent sociability, Munch remained something of an outsider wherever he went. Perhaps the traumas of his childhood limited his ability to fully engage with others. This most memorable canvas is surely the work of an artist resigned to a life of isolation. It is a canvas whose impact on the modern consciousness can hardly be overestimated, heightened by the artist's account of its inspiration. Munch described how he was walking alone during a summer visit to Norway. As the sun was setting, the clouds turned blood red. At that moment, he felt a scream passing through nature. And it was this shriek that provided the subject matter for this astonishing image.
The figure looking at us and screaming is obviously in some terrifying situation, and this situation is reinforced by the fact that the landscape is also painted in a similar way, so that the landscape seems to be screaming. The swirly lines that are in the landscape are repeated in the figure. So in fact there's no escape. And it's this state of mind which I think modern people are particularly drawn to.
The scream remains one of the most familiar images of modern art. Copies of it have been mass-produced, and there are few Western people unaware of its message of existential horror. What is less well known is that Munch intended the canvas to form a part of a far bigger artistic project. By the time the Scream was completed in 1893, Munch had decided to produce a series of paintings designed to be exhibited in a single gallery space. His ambitious idea was to create a body of work with one unifying theme. In Munch's own words, this was to be nothing less than the poetry of life, love, and death. The name chosen for these works revealed a similar level of ambition, the Frieze of Life.
He began to see himself as producing over the years a series of works which, if you like, catalogued the whole of human existence and its traumas, its highs and its lows. That was his aim. And a lot of the major works never actually came to complete fruition. I think he anticipated it would actually be all hung together at one time as complete sort of surroundings of the human condition in all its aspects.
However, Munch's plans for the Frieze of Life were never brought to fruition. No permanent display of work was ever set up. An exhibition in Berlin in 1902 of 22 paintings was the closest that the artist came to realizing his grand ambition.
Munch created the Frieze of Life over 30 years of his life, and he wanted to show love, life and death as he saw it. Of course, it goes back to his early childhood experiences as well, and his constant philosophizing and worrying about man's position in the world and the universe, and the great questions of the emotions and loss.
The concept of the Frieze of Life is still helpful for understanding the concerns of Munch's art. The notion of the poetry of life, love, and death informed some of the finest paintings of his career. Given Munch's childhood, it is not surprising that he was a master at capturing the last moments of life. The title of this dignified 1893 deathbed image is revealing: The Dead Mother. 25 years after Laura Munch's death, her son remained haunted by her loss. This image suggests a release from suffering and depicts the torments of earthly life, which were included in Munch's Frieze of Life concept. With this 1895 canvas simply entitled Melancholy, we can see the clear influence of Gauguin incorporated into a picture that reveals a subject profoundly isolated from the enveloping landscape. However, it may be Munch's depictions of love that form the most compelling elements of his Frieze of Life work. There are no images of conjugal bliss. Instead, the artist focused his attention on what he saw as the threefold nature of female sexuality. First came the awakening of the sexual identity, as can be seen in this 1895 canvas entitled Puberty. As might be expected, this is an image of vulnerability and of the desire to preserve modesty. However, it also represents puberty as being only a phase of life, a passage into the full blossom of womanhood. Such inevitability is shown in another mid-1890s canvas, Woman in Three Stages. On the left of the painting, the notion of sexual awakening can be identified, while further to the right is shown the darkness of a woman long past the age of reproduction. This is the third stage of female sexuality, death itself. But it is the nude figure in the middle that may reveal most about Munch's intentions as an artist and his feelings as a man. Time and again, Munch sought to convey what he saw as woman's darker side, woman as seducer and destroyer. This canvas depicting a young woman as a vampire, dramatically reveals this concern. There is nothing this sorry male can do here. He is powerless to resist, and his destruction is sealed. This image retains the capacity to shock many first-time viewers. But it is just one of many Munch canvases conveying what he saw as the darker side of womanhood. For many, the most powerful of these is the Madonna, the creation of an artist whose real feelings about women are still discussed today.
She symbolizes Munch's idea of the ideal femme fatale, if you like, the ideal woman, but it's not personalized, it's woman rather than a woman. And around the outside of the figure of the woman, he's painted sperm and embryo, so obviously he's connecting this impersonal creature that he's created with the birth of life.
He both adored and yet he was intensely frightened because it's towering above him as if he's looking up at it. It's dominating, which is frightening, yet he's adoring. So it's got very overt sexual connotations there. And this does reflect what one feels is a problem that he had with his relationships with women.
We know that Munch did have affairs, including one which came to an end in bizarre circumstances early in the 20th century. But none proved satisfactory, and his opinion of women as a whole was surely a factor. Canvases such as this image of his Berlin friend, Dagny Juel, present a representation that reveals more menace than beauty. Munch was fascinated by the negative effects that woman could have upon man. This 1895 canvas also depicts Dagny Juel in the role of seductress. To the right, we see her husband, Stanislav Przebysewski, looking towards the viewer in resignation, with the symbolist use of green adding to the impression of jealousy that gives the work its title. At the time, the Berlin avant-garde group to which Munch belonged was keen on the idea of free love, with Dagny Juel at the center of attention. Not for the last time, advocates of free love in theory found it harder to live with in practice. The amount of alcohol consumed by Munch and his friends in Berlin both aggravated and inspired his work. Although alcohol would later cause Munch health problems, both mental and physical, this contemporary canvas presents a powerfully atmospheric self-portrait, painted at the height of his powers.
In this picture we see Munch looking at us, very pale-faced, like a ghost, emerging from the gloomy background, staring eyes, holding this cigarette with the smoke of which comes up like flames from hell, if you like. He looks as if he's liable to disintegrate into the background of the painting, in fact.
There seems a mismatch between what we see and his productions, his work. To me, anyway, he seems a somewhat nervous individual, somewhat withdrawn, and yet his works are so powerful and strong.
Munch's work had begun to expand into other media, and in 1894 he produced his first series of etchings, using such techniques as aquatints, lithographs and woodcuts in both monochrome and colour. Some of these prints were versions of images already tackled by the artist in his paintings. In this lithograph from 1902, Munch depicts the dangerous Madonna figure with a seemingly lifeless fetus cowering in the bottom left of the image, framed by swimming sperm.
He revelled in the problems and the discipline that the print media imposed. And he used to make prints of his paintings. So he saw the prints as a development, if you like, of something he'd captured in his paintings, a development and a slightly different way of looking at things. He had definite ideas about how you could use printing techniques. The etching, for example, was for line. The lithographs was for emotion and sentimental feelings.
One of the things which we must remember in Northern European art is the very strong strand of printmaking. It had always been strong. Not the refined sort of delicate etching and engraving, but much more the wood cut. And Munch simply continued this on. And we see it coming through in other expressionists, in the work of people like Die Brücke, Carl Schmidt-Rottluff and so forth, at the beginning of the 20th century. A powerful use of the black and white image, sometimes coloured, but the very strong areas. And to that extent, Edvard Munch always was a printmaker, and he continued to be a printmaker and made tremendous use of it.
One valuable consequence of Munch's graphic work was that it helped to spread his fame throughout Europe. By 1900, his exhibitions had been staged as far west as London and as far east as St. Petersburg. But serious problems had now begun to affect the artist's life. This canvas, produced in 1900, gives some insight into one of them. The inspiration for The Dance of Life is clearly similar to that of the Three Stages of Woman, but it presents a far more personal image. It portrays Tulle Larsen, a wealthy young Norwegian woman, and playwright Gunnar Heiberg, who introduced Munch to Larsen. Munch could not commit himself to the relationship, apparently troubled by his own family history of madness and illness. This portrayal may have been intended to depict what he thought of Gunnar Heiberg as the man who had introduced them to each other.
There was a young woman who was in love with Munch, Tulle Larsen, and he rejected her. Later on, she sent her friends to see him and tell him that she was dying, and would he come? So he went, and when he got into her room, there she was, lying on the bed and not dead at all. And she sat up and had a gun in her hand and said that if he didn't love her, she would kill herself. So he went towards her to try and take the gun, and she fired a shot and damaged one of his fingers.
To Edvard Munch, this whole thing presented him with death immediately, and then death didn't happen. The explosion did, but not the death, and therefore it was resurrection. In a sense, it freed him, I think, at that point. It seems to have freed him.
Munch's relationship with Tulle Larsen severely affected his artistic production. This, coupled with an increasingly nomadic existence, heavy drinking, and heated public arguments with his friends, exacerbated his already unstable condition and would ultimately lead to his demise. In 1905, Munch shot and wounded painter Ludwig Carsten in a dispute. By 1908, his situation had reached crisis point. That year, while living in Copenhagen, he suffered a breakdown. Munch spent 8 months in a clinic in Copenhagen, where he was treated by Dr. Daniel Jacobsen. As Dr. Gachet had done for Van Gogh 19 years earlier, Jacobsen sat for a portrait by Munch.
It's certainly clear that he was unsure of the way to go forward. He was unsure of his place, his relationships with other people, particularly women. He'd achieved a certain fame, which in a sense, in a perverse way, I think he was worried about. I think all of this came to a head, and with no one really to share it with.
For the past 17 years, Munch had been painting maniacally and also travelling around promoting his work. And by 1908, he'd reached such a point of nervous tension and stress that he could no longer continue and had to go into the asylum, where he received electric shock treatment. And actually, when he came out, he gave up drinking completely. And this made him into a different man.
In contrast to Van Gogh, Munch made a full recovery from both his breakdown and alcoholism, and lived for a further 35 years. Munch's recovery marked the end of his greatest achievements as an artist. In the years that followed, he returned to Norway and sought such work as public mural commissions. However, his 1911 image of the sun for the Great Hall of Christiania University revealed a symbolist painter still capable of inspired work. Munch also developed an interest in painting ordinary working people, of which this 1915 image of workers returning home is one of his most successful efforts. Munch's post-breakdown images are said to lack the power of his previous paintings, suggesting that the inspiration for his earlier work was drawn from his own mental instability.
In Munch's work of the 1890s and through to about 1908, his subject matter was almost entirely his own neuroses, in my opinion. Negative emotions such as sense of loss, jealousy, fear of sexuality, fear of closeness. He seems to have had problems with boundaries. He was afraid of being engulfed by sexual partners, possibly by other people, and at the same time he was afraid of being abandoned. And he doesn't seem to have struck a happy medium. Even though he painted all these pictures trying to work out the problems, it actually took a nervous breakdown and treatment for him to snap out of it, so to speak.
Edvard Munch survived until the Second World War and was able to continue painting almost to the end of his life. Many of his admirers believe that only as his own death grew near did his work reclaim any of the power that it once had. This 1940s self-portrait at the window conveys a striking contrast between the nature of the human life force and the cold, eternal death that lies inevitably ahead.
Well, after Munch came out of the asylum, his attitude towards his art changed. He relaxed. He had fame in his own country where he went to live. And he became more interested in social questions. And he was interested, obviously, in work itself, because his own work had been so therapeutic, probably, for him. He was interested in other types of work. And he was interested in working men, that kind of normal life.
In a sense, it was comforting, the ordinary life of ordinary people pursuing their ordinary, mundane ways, I feel was perhaps a comfort to him. On the other hand, he had also been influenced by the socialist concern that he'd met with in Paris, Camille Pissarro and others, and was concerned with worrying about welfare and all the things which the 20th century began to tackle, welfare, education, health and so on.
The work that Munch did immediately after his breakdown was for Oslo University. And these paintings, murals, very large, are peaceful, family-orientated, and completely lack the emotional intensity of his earlier work. And most of his later work lacks that intensity. Not all of it. Sometimes his self-portraits are quite intense. But he did scenes of the countryside, he did landscapes, villages, working men and people and women. it just lacks the focus of the earlier work.
His anguish had calmed down. He was leading a more settled existence, a calmer existence. And in that sense, this was reflected in his work, which is quite natural. That was what he painted. He painted his own relationship to the external world.
Edvard Munch died on the 23rd of January 1944 at the age of 80. He had emerged from obscurity and adversity to become one of the best-known artists in the whole of Europe. His triumph was in transforming the traumatic content of his life into physical form through his painting and printmaking. The enduring potency of his work, The Scream, is testimony to his achievement.
His works are him, his neuroses, his attitudes, his ambivalences, his enthusiasms, his experience. He's important as an expressionist, but it is as an echo, as a mouthpiece in, for instance, The Scream, of the 20th century.
Munch's work created a spiritual landscape in which the German expressionists were able to flourish. He influenced Kokoschka, and his graphic works were influential to all kinds of artists. After his death, there were a lot of exhibitions all over the world, in fact, and this spread knowledge of his painting. And today he's held in very high esteem for the intensity of his depiction of psychological human states.